if there were sounds and he thought they were beautiful, he wanted to find a way to create something even more beautiful.
But those songs got to him in somewhere inside, and he was able to manifest, right, to another level. But the crazy thing about it is he was able to take it and put it into pop songs with 3 chords.
And clear of the closing doors, please.
What up, son? What up? Grind and pivot, pivotal moments that changed everything. Louis Max, Queens, New York. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with an author, aficionado of music, big-time vinyl record collector. But don't let that fool you. This guy knows his shit. He wrote a great book about Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys. It really is I believe it's one of the first complete and thorough career spanning textbooks really about the music of Brian Wilson. His name, Christian Matijas-MECCA. Welcome to the show. I appreciate you. How you doing, baby?
Thanks, Louis. Thanks for having me on today.
Great to see you. Full transparency, Christian, we don't really know each other. He got recommended to us by a good friend of mine, one of our producers, but we've talked a little bit prior, and we found that we have a ton in common. We're going to be talking about a couple of different things, but first, give us a little background, a little idea of who you are, where you're from, and what you're doing.
I always say that I was born in East LA, then moved to South Central LA, and then spent a chunk of my childhood in South Bay of Los Angeles, Redondo Beach, Hermosa Beach area. And then I moved to Long Beach. And then when I was somewhere near 30, I moved to the Midwest for what reason I do not know. I think it was called a job, but.
Fantastic. So let's talk musically when you grew up. So you grew up in the 70s, early, late 60s?
60s and 70s.
Okay,
I had my first vinyl in 1966.
What was the first vinyl in 66?
It was a novelty record, okay. a Spanish language novelty record. I'm half Mexican, so I had this novelty record called Tacos for Two. 78.
Fantastic. Wow.
I've got a file of it. I mean, it's just, it's a comedy record, a novelty record. But that was my first record in 1966.
Oh my God, amazing! So you got bitten by the music bug early as a collector,
yep.
and what was the genre that really got you going at the time?
I would say before I could read, I was a huge fan of music like Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass. The Whipped Cream and Other Delights album is probably that early realization of sexual preference when you see that cover.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I think I have it on vinyl.
Everybody has that.
Right. Exactly.
Everybody has that record. And then, music like Henry Mancini and Burt Bacharach. But by the time I could read, hard rock and psychedelic rock was already out there, and I was very taken with that. And what really kicked it into overdrive was my father, with whom I don't have a relationship with my family, but my father, for some unknown reason, for my 7th birthday, bought me a copy of what was then newly released, the original 2-album set on Decca Records of Jesus Christ Superstar.
Okay.
And I read liner notes. Even then, learning how to read, I read liner notes obsessively. And it said, in the acknowledgments, thanks to Deep Purple for Ian Gillan, because Ian Gillan sang the role of Jesus. And I liked the name Deep Purple. I knew there was a song called Deep Purple, an old standard.
Standard, right?
And I went to one of my older cousins and I said, "What's a Deep Purple?" And I'm 7 years old, and he pulls out In Rock. And I'm just like, holy Christ. And so there I'm just sort of lost.
That's a great story on how everything kind of came to be.
Yeah.
And then you continued in that hard rock vein?
Everything? No, I think it went everything. I was always more drawn to um, psychedelia and I don't want to say pop music, but I was drawn more toward the, as much as I'm a lifelong Deep Purple fan, um, music like the Beach Boys, like the Beatles, like early psychedelia. That was really where I was focused.
Right. So yeah, because I mean, back then on the radio, you basically had, Herb Alpert, you had the Beatles, you had the top 40,
Yeah,
you had a
yeah,
lot of that stuff coming through. So that's really where that one end came from. I
right.
mean, I have to think probably some hard rock stuff wasn't on the radio as much, but there were some FM stations at that time
Oh yeah,
starting
yeah,
to sprout out.
yeah.
What year? Bring me to the year so I can.
Sure. 1970, I get the copy of Jesus Christ Superstar.
Yeah, I was gonna say 69. Okay, right,
Um,
right.
that was my 7th birthday. Yeah, I think I was completely into music even as a first, second grader, but somewhere around 1972, my dad was throwing out boxes of his old stuff, and there was a. Do you remember when you used to store 45 singles in those bound books that you crack open and they'd each have a sleeve and you'd
Yeah,
stick?
absolutely, of course.
He had all these bound things with all his old 45s, and he had an original RCA single of 3 Elvis Presley
I
singles.
knew that you were gonna say Elvis. Good.
And I, one was Hound Dog, another one was Don't Be Cruel, another one was Jailhouse Rock, all on the original RCA black label.
Right.
And once I heard those and the immediacy of that, by the time before I was 10, I knew who Lieber and Stoller were. I knew who Phil Spector was. I was already aware of the Beach Boys and the Beatles, but that whole tradition of the Brill Building, and I could never figure out how, I still hadn't read enough. I didn't know how Burt Bacharach was Brill Building and Carole
Right.
King
Carole
was Brill
King,
Building,
right? Cynthia Mann, Barry Mann,
and
Cynthia Weil, right?
Ellie Greenwich,
Ellie Greenwich, right? Absolutely.
and then you get Lieber and Stoller, who were
Yeah,
Brill Building.
Giants.
Yeah. So I'm just, I don't remember
Yeah.
much else about my childhood except the records I played.
Right. Now, did you? I mean, I did the same thing. I think I got you by a couple of years. I'm a couple of years older than you.
Hmm.
So, because 69, 70, I remember Jesus Christ Superstar 100% because I Don't Know How to Love Him was huge.
Yeah.
On
Yvonne
the radio,
Elliman. Yep.
Right. That was huge. And then Ho Santa, Hey Santa.
Yeah.
The whole thing was a big deal. Now, I used to get the records, and I'm sure you did the same thing. I was talking to a friend of mine about this the other day. Our information off the records were the liner notes, correct?
Yeah. Liner notes.
Did you really? I mean, it sounds like you did the same thing. Those liner notes were gospel, right?
Yep.
And you still can the engineers, the producers, Charlie Kalala, Al Schmidt, all these guys, Tom Dowd. You remember, right? You remember every one of them.
I remember reading the back cover. I got those Elvis Presley singles, and then for my birthday that year, I got Elvis's Golden Records, the first volume on RCA, and the back sleeve was just all liner notes, talking about these hit records. And of course, they're talking about Lieber Stoller on there. And they talk about the A&R guy for RCA, Steve Scholes, who's the one who bought out Elvis's contract from
Sun.
Yeah, he bought it was Steve Scholes, and I thought this guy must be, you read that, and that's the only understanding of this music, that some guy was hip enough to buy Elvis's contract, and I imagine he was some New York hipster with a sharp-skinned suit, and then years later, I saw a picture of Steve Scholes, and he was this obese and plain and dumpy guy in an enormous suit, and I'm like, this is the guy who bought Elvis's contract.
Crazy.
He looks like some couch potato. But that was Steve Scholes. But yeah, you read the liner notes, and I remember Superstar came with this really elaborate long form book. Yeah, long form book, and it had the lyrics, but it had every credit in the world. So Henry McCullough, who was later with Wings, was one of the guitarists on there. Absolutely. I mean, there were Chris Spedding was a guitarist on there.
Absolutely, Chris Spedding.
And it just saw it, and then but Ian Gillan, and I'm like, what's a Deep Purple? And God, I mean, talk about asking to be hit in the face.
That's great. Yeah, I remember when I heard, when Hush,
Yeah.
I think, I believe Machine Head. Machine
Machine Head was
Machine
72,
Head
but
was 70, right? Exactly. I
yeah,
mean, let's see, so 70. Yeah, I was playing piano around that time. Procol Harum was
yep,
happening. The Hammond was big
yep.
at that time. But then also at the same time, were you into any of the other stuff like the Neil Young stuff, the Dead?
The,
Did you
ki-
get
the
into any of that
yeah,
California
you know,
stuff?
the California singer-songwriter sound I never really got into. I I like the Beach Boys, and I liked a lot of other 60s pop music. The Airplane, Jefferson Airplane. I liked artists like that. I really didn't get into the singer-songwriter thing. I was big into oh God, I'm drawing a blank on her name. The one woman who was part of that crowd, Jackie DeShannon, Needles and
Oh
Pins.
yeah, I put a little,
Jackie,
yeah,
yeah,
right, right, put
and
a
so Jackie
little, right.
DeShannon. But no, I wasn't into the '70s Laurel Canyon sound. In fact, I always say, to me, that's just. And I respect those artists. I respect Linda Ronstadt greatly. I respect a lot of those artists, but Laurel Canyon sound was not my thing at all.
Okay.
But I got into punk in '76, '77, and that's really where that shift happened.
Great. Okay, so that's a good
Yeah.
segue. So we could go into punk because we're going to circle back a little bit. But so the punk stuff you're talking about with like a lot of the New York bands like
Yep.
Tough Darts and Johnny Thunders,
Yeah, the
Ramones,
Heartbreakers, the Ramones.
that whole scene. Now that whole scene was right in my backyard.
Yeah, yeah.
You
And to
know,
me, that
I,
was some faraway exotic land to me because,
Television,
yep, Mar-
Blondie, yeah, all those bands. Suicide.
and Blondie, Ellie Greenwich sang backup on a number of songs, and I thought, Ellie Greenwich, Phil Spector, and then their first record was on Private Stock, which is owned by Frankie Valli. I was a huge Four Seasons fan,
Okay, me
enormous
too.
Four
Me too.
Seasons
So
fan,
we could talk about, yeah. I mean, we could talk
and
about the Four Seasons
and
also with
so,
Crew and Gaudio.
oh
I mean,
yeah,
that's
yeah, yeah,
amazing. Yeah,
yeah.
that's a whole separate thing, right?
Yeah, so that's so. But I always saw this overlap: Ellie Greenwich singing with Blondie, the Ramones doing the bubblegum sound, and Joey was hugely influenced by that sound.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. Well, didn't
so
Phil produce one of those records, one of the
Spectre,
Ramones
yeah, he
records, right?
did. Yeah,
I
End of
believe
the
he did.
Century.
And the
Yeah,
Century, right? Exactly.
yeah.
So, what was your motivation for writing a book about Brian Wilson?
It goes back to. Do you remember there was a documentary about 8 years ago, 7, 8 years, stardom about the backup singers?
Yeah,
Remember, it was
20
a
Feet to Stardom. Yes,
documentary
yes,
about all
yes,
these
absolutely.
backup singers. So
I love
Darlene
that. I
Love,
love that. Darlene
etc.
Love, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. So yeah, yeah. So
Yeah, who's the girl?
my
Who's the
girlfriend and
girl
I
who
went to
sang
that movie
on
with
the brown shirt on the Stones? She was part of it also, right?
Mary
Uh,
Clayton. Mary
yeah, Mary
Clayton.
Clayton. Mary Clayton, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Saw that movie, and my girlfriend and I went to see that. We were out with some friends, and I'm talking about Holland Dozier Holland and the studio work that's going on. And I had just been reacquainted after literally forgetting about it for many years um, with their output. I always knew their Motown output, but the output they put out, the material they put out in the late 60s, early 70s on their own Invictus label. And that stuff I remember hearing on soul music stations in the early 70s. So while I'm a huge Elvis fan and listening to the Four Seasons and that, when you'd hear soul music, you would hear these really tight soul records
Yeah.
coming out of and I didn't know it was Holland Dozier Holland at the time, but anyway, I'd just stumbled across some things about this period of music and was talking with them, and my girlfriend, who's written books on pop music herself, she said, "Why don't you write a book on this?" I said, "Never thought about it." And I was like, "Oh, I'll think about that." And then she connected me with an editor who was looking for an author for a series. And he said, "Oh, we're looking for somebody to do Brian Wilson. I don't know if that's up your alley." I said, "I know it back and front." So that's how I wrote it. And I love the music, and it was a fortuitous opportunity to have a chance to write about it.
Great. So you were a Beach Boys fan, you said before.
Yeah.
Did you see them live ever? Did you ever get to see them live when
I
early 70s?
no, I didn't see them live then. I grew up, as I said, I grew up in the South Bay area. So, the Beach Boys were from Hawthorne, California. I was from Redondo Beach. I'm 21 years younger than Brian Wilson,
Right.
same month and a week earlier. You're aware of it. It kind of is imbued in the whole Southern California being. It's just that music is so embedded into it. And so I never saw them live. All I remember as a kid was hearing about how I remember seeing Wilson on Saturday Night Live in late '75, that first season where they did that embarrassing sketch with him surfing in the water. And all I knew was the guy that wrote this amazing music was this mental case that was sort of like a perverted, a social fetish to watch this man in his broken down state. And I never thought too much about it. I just listened to the music, but I never saw the band because I knew that the guy who made the music was no longer with them as a performing entity.
Correct.
So
Correct.
I just wasn't really interested in seeing them live.
So what did you find out? What did you find out about him as you started to uncover and go through from the beginning that might be a deduction of something that a lot of people, don't really know, except, it's funny because everybody, a musician or people that know his music, and have studied and listened to his music, they all know this guy was head and shoulders in many, many ways, arrangements, hearing, obviously creativity. We know that. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, and we also know what society or has painted a picture of him of being, mentally having some problems, whether they were drug induced, whether they were, from his family, from the whole father, the whole life of the Beach Boys. So, I mean, we know that, but if anybody, the normal person says, "Oh yeah, Brian Wilson, yeah, unbelievable talent, but he's a nut job." Okay, so he's a nut job. All right, were you were able to? Were you and did you obviously get past that? And what did you deduct from this whole exercise? That's a good exercise in your research.
I never was attracted to the whole thing about the guy with mental illness and making sort of a public spectacle of him, dragging him out on stage and making him play. I never got into that. And I read probably every book that's been written on the Beach Boys, on Brian Wilson. There are a couple of books that,
preparation.
Yeah, it's preparation.
Okay.
You gotta read what's out there, and
of course,
there are a couple books that do legitimate musical analysis of his music, of his work, and they're good books. But there's something more to it than the analysis. And then all the books are always talking about him with the Beach Boys, him with the Beach Boys. And the more I looked at his music, I realized the guy produced volumes of music for other artists.
Yeah, he collaborated with a lot of people, right?
Yeah, and he, not just that, but I look back at a composer like Franz Schubert, dies at the age of 31. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart dies in his mid-30s. These guys who produced volumes of music and then they died. We don't know what they would have done afterwards. They may have done nothing. They may have written music that wasn't that interesting. They may have written good music. We don't know. But I kind of saw Wilson in the same way. Here was a guy who produced, 8 years of pretty remarkable. Nobody else could copy it. I mean, it was completely original what he was writing. And for 8 years, he produced this work. And then he had, for whatever reason, a shift, and he stopped doing it. And the more that I read into it, I was reading about a guy who, like me, he couldn't swim, he didn't surf, wasn't your classic California guy, but he created a myth about California, a sound that, the way that the Strauss family, they're the sound of Vienna. Brian Wilson is the sound of Southern California.
That's so interesting that you say that. You're right. Because we're talking about the culture of American culture, the understanding of the American culture and that music at that time. Now you're right. That's interesting because
and he captures that sound, and it is the sound of Southern California. He wasn't a ladies' man. He didn't surf. He was a kind of not simple. He was an uncomplicated guy who liked food and he liked his girlfriends and he liked making music. And that's kind of all that was important to him. Well, in the book, I make a point to discuss all the music he writes for everybody and that he produces for everyone. and not focus only on the Beach Boys. And then looking at the themes that he writes about and how he's trying to create a sound that he hears in his head is pretty remarkable. But what you find is that, when he's a commodity, when he no longer can be trusted to make the records that the public wants him to make, then that's where the problems arise. The minute that people began to question what he was doing, when he was making all those records from 63 to 67, no one questioned a word. I mean, this is a great record, it's going forward. And he got so far out there in creating more elaborate music, and people are saying, well, what the hell is this? And he lost his confidence. And if you've had 4 years of where whatever you write, people are responding to it. The music, once he quit making it, and it wasn't that he had a breakdown, he just couldn't make music if people were going to question him on what it was about.
Right.
And then it became this battle for his creative identity. When he would produce things, people would say, well, that's not really a Beach Boys record. And they're like,
they were conditioned already.
Yeah. And so he just became, and I understand it. You don't want what I have, then I'm not going to make it.
Yeah. What, who was responsible? I mean, they were young.
Yeah.
They were very young. So who was responsible? Who was running the show? Was the old man running the show at some point? Who was running the show?
Well, yeah, the father Murray ran it until the mid 60s. And then the band tried to function a bit like a collective where they each had a say on what would happen. So they never really had clear management. They had good management, but it wasn't clear. It was a family band, even though the father was a complete nut job himself.
Right.
It was a family concern, and they made music thinking as a family. When they became managed by other people, they tried to retain that sense of the family, but everybody had a voice, and everybody's voice began to get into the mix, where before it had just been Brian's voice. And I don't know, I think he's someone who was easily influenced. I don't think he could tell when people didn't have his best interests in mind.
Really?
He is, his identity seems to be one of complete, there's no guile to him. He truly kind of lives in his own world, and you could be a scamster and completely scam him and he wouldn't know it, because he doesn't think that way.
Interesting.
He thinks of everything as a source of an inspiration or an idea. And I think the more people that came around him that were there for themselves, more and more of those voices got in the mix, and it just began to throw him off.
Yeah, and those people, a lot of them had dollar signs in, the motivation is obviously, listen, we're making money here and we could make a ton more, and we're going to take advantage. I mean, the sharks come out.
Yeah. And I frankly think that he was someone without guile. He wasn't naive. He was not naive, but he didn't critically look at who was telling him things. And they'd say, you're going to make this, you're going to make that, and it's going to be great. And he wouldn't think, what is their intention for wanting me to do these things? So, and once his music became more elaborate, people began to say, well, yeah, but, and once I say in the book that Brian Wilson never stopped making music. He just quit making the music that people thought was the Beach Boys.
Right. So he kind of got pigeonholed a little bit early on, and then he didn't really have the people around him that wanted to take him in another direction, because A, it wasn't going to make them money, and B, it probably was, some of the music probably was it wasn't AM radio, it wasn't hits, it wasn't the surfing, it wasn't all American.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming now was he experimenting in the psychedelic drugs at that? Was that an escape? Was that an escape for him? Was that
I think it was just an experiment.
Yeah.
And people made it more and more available, and
sure,
it just became out of hand. But for him, it was an experience. Anything that was going to tap into his creativity. He was open to trying.
Who was his main confidant back then? Not the guru, not the guy later on,
Yeah.
not the doctor. I'm talking who were you able to uncover or get a sense of who, let's say, either in the family or somebody that was a friend of his that really kind of had his back, but couldn't fight the battles?
His first wife, Marilyn, is much more important than she's given credit for.
Okay, that's
I
interesting.
mean, they married when they were very young, but she was his confidant. She existed to make his life easier, to make it doable. I think there were other people, other collaborators who had short-term relationships with him as, trying to have his back. And I think his brother, both Carl and Dennis, he was very, very close to both of those brothers, even though all three were very different. He was extremely close to them, but they were also out on the road making the money playing his music. So he didn't really have somebody always there whom he could trust. I think most of the time it was Marilyn is who he went to, and Marilyn was a sweet teenage girl. I mean, they married when she was, not even 17.
Yeah, too young.
And so, but she was there, and she was there to listen to him and be his sounding board.
Now let's backtrack for a second. You said you've been a collector. And I also know that you play piano, you play harpsichord, but you also didn't really start playing and learning until you were in your late teens.
Yep.
So I mean, you now have a great sense of what music and how it works in terms from the classics. Now, the question, I know I answered the question, but I'm gonna just veer back. Did you play some of that stuff as you were learning music? Were you playing pop songs? Were you playing, basic C chords and, just the easy stuff because it really is simple. His stuff is super, super, super simple, except that, obviously his melodies, we're not singing or we're not hearing his melodies.
No, I didn't really play that. To me, it was, I don't want to say a product. It was an artifact. The recorded sound, the single, the album, those were recorded artifacts. Those were sort of sacrosanct. I didn't try to replicate them.
That's interesting. Okay.
It's like the music, Don't Worry Baby is not just the song. It's just not the chords or the melody or the harmonies or the arrangement. It's that whole captured recording on tape.
Yeah, 100%.
That's the artifact.
True. That's true.
So that's what I was always focused on, was the artifact.
Okay.
And I treated a live performance as not a replication of the artifact, but a replication of the artist giving you a flavor of what the artifact is, but it's not copying it. And it never dawned on me that I should want to replicate that.
Okay, that's fair. I respect that. So what did you find out musically from him that was either surprising or something you could actually figure out and say, wow, this is really amazing?
Oh, there are a number of things. One, that he heard everything in his head, and he learned, and it wasn't, he was naturally gifted. There's no question. There was the gods shone on him. Mm-hmm. But he sat for hours and dissected the harmonies, the four freshmen.
The arrangements, right?
He took them apart piece by piece, memorized them, and taught them to his family. So his mother, the two brothers, he would teach them the parts, and they'd all sing the songs together.
Oh, interesting.
And he knew the sound he wanted to achieve. So he had a sound that he could divine in his head. That's one thing. That's a given. But it didn't just happen. It wasn't like the lights went on. He spent probably from 1957 to 1961 listening to those records constantly. And he also, the other thing is, there's a real innocence and simplicity about him. Like, there's no guile. So he can do a song like Graduation Day, which is to hear it today, it's this kind of syrupy ballad song.
Fluffy. Yeah.
But he was singing that. He would make that arrangement for them to sing it, and it was completely sincere. It wasn't about being hip or not hip or
Right.
syrupy or sappy. It was like, oh, this is a great song, so I'm going to arrange it.
Oh,
And
I got you.
so he
Okay.
had apps. So that's why he could borrow music, a melody from Disney to create Surfer Girl. He can borrow from When You Wish Upon a Star um, to create Surfer Girl. I mean, it was no guile. He saw that, if there were sounds and he thought they were beautiful, he wanted to find a way to create something even more beautiful.
Yeah. So that's genius.
That's, yeah,
That's genius.
yeah,
That really is genius, because I think it's funny, as musicians, we might all think that way,
yeah,
or think that we can do that, and you can do that, but it comes out contrived a lot of the time. So lately I've been just going back into some old standard stuff. When I knew I was talk to you, you had mentioned the whole thing about the Four Freshmen and Brian, that stuff. I mean, I went back to like Harry Warren,
yeah, yeah,
and the
yeah.
songs, the lyrics, the song, Julie Stein, I Only Have Eyes for You. I mean, those songs, he basically took those songs, but those songs got to him in somewhere inside, and he was able to manifest, right, to another level. But the crazy thing about it is he was able to take it and put it into pop songs
Yeah.
with 3 chords.
Yeah. And make something completely different, which is,
Correct.
The reason you can hear elements of Mozart's music and Beethoven's music. They take what they hear and they go, oh, Christ, I'm creating something else. And that's the genius of it, is being able to take what comes before, to respect it, to have real respect for it. You don't go, oh, this is my grandmother's music, or this is my
Right.
parents. You don't say that.
Right.
You're
Right.
like you said, in the music of Irving Berlin, Jules Stein. I mean, he loved George Gershwin.
I was going to say Gershwin for sure.
Gershwin, he
Huge.
loves
Huge.
his music, and
Right.
it was never about, oh, this isn't hip music. This is amazing music. What can I
Right.
do to make it in my voice?
Right. Was he a big Beatles fan?
Oh
What
yeah,
was
they were
it?
they were they were
When-
big Beatles fans. When he said that when the Beatles played Ed Sullivan, he said he was aware that the world had changed musically, but
Right.
he didn't take it as a threat. It was a challenge. It's like, okay, they're going to make a record. I'm going to make a better record. And it didn't bother him.
Right.
He doesn't, it didn't really bother him that the British invasion wiped out all of American pop music. I mean, the only people left standing were the Beach Boys and the Four Seasons, really, at that
Right.
time. I mean, it took a long time for the American scene to kind of
To
build back.
recover. Yeah. No. Absolutely.
But he didn't view that as territorial. It was a challenge.
Right. Again, that's why
Yeah.
that's really why he stands head and shoulders or separate. I mean, listen, there are many, many, many unique, unbelievable, musicians and gifted people, whether they be from the jazz end, from the
Yeah.
singer, and we know that. But this guy definitely stands alone, or with them, not alone,
And that's
with
what,
them.
and that's why there's no guile. It's not like he sees it as, oh, they're taking my turf or they're taking my popularity. It's like, wow, what can I do that's better? I mean, you have to have no sense of being, you have to have a complete innocence to be able to look at that and go with it in that way.
Absolutely. Yeah, and not be
And-
influenced, right?
Yeah. And so that's part of his music. What else is part of his music that he would hear? It wasn't just words. The sounds were just, had he known how to write music, to literally write it down, he might have had an easier time. The Beatles had George Martin to do their arrangements.
Yeah, the
They
transcriptions,
would play their
right,
stuff,
right.
but when they did A Day in the Life, there's George Martin. When they
Yeah.
do Eleanor Rigby, there's George Martin.
Yeah.
Brian literally sang everybody's part to them, and they had to
And they had to
learn it,
learn it and do it. Right.
and then they build it that way. Phil Spector had Jack Nietzsche writing out parts. Brian didn't have anybody writing out parts. So it took a lot longer to make the records, but it was that same, he was hearing it layer by layer by layer by layer, and then he'd blend it in, and it all worked. That's, had he had somebody to help him with that, that might have been different.
Interesting.
So-
Why do you think he might not have had somebody to help? I mean, weren't everybody was at their beck and call pretty much?
Yeah, but he's, the point is, he's hearing the music and he's turning it out so quickly,
It's him.
he doesn't have time to tell somebody what to write.
Right.
He can just say, I'm going to go in and you're going to play this, you're going to sing this, let's do it this way. And it's just as quick as it would be for him to tell somebody how to write it out.
Yeah. I mean, it really was. And, it really was not intricate in terms of changes, in
No,
terms of chordal changes. It
no.
really was not. The intricacies were what he was hearing were really the harmonies, the thirds, the fifths, whatever he was doing. That
Yeah.
might have been, and then he's got that in his head. So he's like saying, fuck it. I'm so and so, Al, you sing this. So,
Yeah.
so and so sing this, and I'm sure the better players, who I'm Glenn Campbell, right?
He had Hal Blaine, he had Glenn
Hal
Campbell.
Blaine, he had all those guys, right?
Yeah.
He had the
Wrecking Crew.
Wrecking
The
Crew,
Wrecking Crew,
right?
yeah.
He had the Wrecking Crew. He had all those guys. So those guys were able to hear what he wanted to say and be able to put it in. And those guys were those were amazing. They were amazing.
Yeah.
Tedesco and those guys, right? Yeah.
Those guys played for Frank Sinatra. They played for.
They were real players.
They played for Herb Alpert. They played for everybody. They could play anything. And so here's a
anything.
guy singing their part, and he's saying, "Okay, you're going to play, a G7 on every third beat."
Right.
I was like, "Okay, G7."
I know.
And he does that, but that's he could tell them exactly what to do. And I think for them, it also gave them a line of creativity because they were used to getting charts and reading it down and doing the whole album in a day. Here's a guy singing these parts that sounds, they could have walked off. I mean, they were simple parts in their own way. They could have walked off saying, "I'm only playing a C. Why am I sitting here?"
Right.
But they all stood in. They all wanted to play because they knew that the sound that was coming together was like nothing else.
It was magic. It turned out to be magic. Yeah, no, it's true because my dad was an arranger, and he had the ears. He had the gift of ears. So you hear something on somebody playing on. He played and he did some arranging for Ed Sullivan and back in the 50s. But to make a long story short, a lot of people do this, but he had the ability to Jerry, play G7 flat 9, whatever it is. Okay. The keys, we're in A, but no good. We gotta take it down. It's gotta be an F or F sharp or something like that. And he's like, okay, sure. No, let's go. I mean, Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Those guys were invaluable, but
Yeah. And I think, what was interesting was in one of the books I'd read that, I mean, as I said, we grew up in the same, within, 7 miles of each other, albeit I was 21 years later. But he went to a junior college in Torrance, where I went to junior college because I didn't know what I was doing at that time in my life. And that's where I got into deciding I was going to be a musician. But it turns out we both shared a teacher, a guy named Dr. Robert Haig. And Brian was a semester away from graduating. And it seems Dr. Haig had helped him think about arranging music, is what he really saw Brian's. He taught him how to arrange music. When I had Robert Haig as a teacher at that point, 24 years later, or 23 years later, I was not a very skilled pianist. I had just started. And he came into class and handed me 2 volumes of Mozart piano concertos. And he said, "Well, I heard you were playing number 23. Why don't, here, take these 2 volumes. You could learn the rest." And I'm like, this guy somehow knew how to, I mean, he was a huge influence to me. I thank him in the foreword to the book. He was a huge influence. He knew that I was not the best pianist in the school, but here he was saying, "Oh, you're playing this? Here, learn the rest of them." And 23 years earlier, he's telling Brian Wilson, "You could finish out the semester, but you're really big on this arranging thing. Go off and arrange music."
Wow.
Yeah.
That's crazy. So in terms of you playing, so you started off self-taught, or you took some lessons? How did you do it?
I had a few primitive lessons to kind of learn there was an alphabet, learn there's a musical staff. I didn't learn anything about technique at all. Did a lot of self-teaching. And then when I decided I was going to go to university, and somebody said, "Well, you got to get a teacher, you got to have an audition." And I had no idea what something. Right. So I got a teacher, and she was a bit of a mental case. She was extremely talented, but a mental case. And she, sort of the way Brian Wilson had to go instrument by instrument and arrange all these songs, like, "You're going to play this." Because I was so late to reading, I used to read everything, learn to read it vertically. So I'd start on the staff, and I'd go, "Okay, there's an F, there's an A flat, there's a D
Oh, you would
flat.
think to yourself, space. So you didn't really learn the lines and spaces
Not
originally
no. I
like
saw it
that.
as I treated it like a painting. You're interpreting a painting.
Interesting.
And then I had to go back and learn how to read it. So I was learning how to read vertically first before I learned how to read horizontally. And so doing that, that's how I built up muscle memory. And she helped me learn how to read better, but also prepared me for an audition, and I got into school. I
That's
mean,
amazing.
I wouldn't have gotten in without her, but
Right.
at that time I went sort of the way that, Wilson listened to the Four Freshmen and the Letterman for 5 years, nonstop. I would listen to all the classical rep nonstop on cassette. I'd buy these 99-cent cassettes. I'd put them on at night. I'd play them all night. And it was, I knew all the Tchaikovsky symphonies. I knew most of the Mozart symphonies. I listened to it ad nauseum until I knew
The
and
actual piece, right?
I understood form. I understood structure.
Okay,
That's
so
how.
that's good point, because I'm thinking back, and a lot of people don't learn that way. They learn the other way.
Yeah.
Here's a Bach invention. Learn the Bach invention, because it's you can learn it.
Yeah.
All right,
Yeah.
let's say you practice your scales, you can read. All right, start learn, even if it's go back talking to a little start, but let's get to we'll go forward. So classical. So you have a Bach convention, you're learning it. But back then, I don't remember any teacher really saying, hey, you know what you should really do? Why don't you go listen to so-and-so playing it on harpsichord or
Yeah.
whatever, and get it and hear it and make it be part of you, which you did. You made it
Yeah.
part of you first, and then it was easy. So you obviously heard it. Now you obviously had that laying in your being, which is to your advantage, but you worked at it.
Yeah. I spent probably 2.5 years listening to this music nonstop, day and night.
Did you like it?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
You dug it, right? You dug it.
Yeah. By that point, this is like 1982. Punk has died. New wave has gone off in this God knows what path. And I'd lost my interest. I lost my interest in a lot of the music because
Depeche Mode.
I didn't like Depeche. I didn't like a lot. I didn't like these.
Shout out to
boys.
my boy Mitch Smiley for Depeche Mode. I know.
I'm the guys with the small frames and sassy haircuts. It wasn't for me at all. So I was just like, I felt like my musical world had kind of died. And
yeah, I hear you, man.
And so yes, I liked this music and I was totally taken with it.
That's great. Your favorite composer?
Debussy.
Me too. Prelude from Afternoon of Thorn.
That's the piece.
Oh my God.
That's the piece that made me decide I was going to become a musician. I heard that piece and
really?
I said, "Oh, that's
Reverie, right?
That's Afternoon of Fawn. It's magical. Okay, I'm going to be a musician." Didn't know what the hell that meant.
It was. Yeah, me too. Yeah, I auditioned with a Chopin etude to get into college as well.
Mm-hmm.
I was a rocker. I was kind of like you. I was a rocker. I was into all the other stuff, into the performance end, into the entertainment end. So I got it. But when you bring up the fact of listening to it and having it become you, my parents listened to it. They went to the opera. They were brought up on that kind of stuff. So that's that's Tchaikovsky. That's Stravinsky. They knew that stuff.
Yeah.
Of course you hear things now that but as soon as I hear Debussy, it's like something. I'm like,
yeah,
right. It's nice, right?
Yeah. That's it. So that's probably my favorite if I have to choose, and only because I guess he's my first. So. My first, but
I love that. Right.
Yeah.
So getting back so you did the Brian Wilson book, and we're going to leave the description and how to get it and check it out. I think everybody should. It's called The Words and Music of Brian Wilson. We'll put some links down there. I recommend it highly. You also wrote a book recently about the psychedelic genre of music. Can you want to tell us about that a little bit?
Yeah, it was another book series from a different publisher, but it was a series of books on genres, and they're meant to be for, high school age, young adults, high school age. If you want to learn about a genre of music, country western, you want to learn about hair bands, you want to learn about heavy metal, and it's supposed to
Love
be
it.
an introduction to the genre and what records you would listen to and things about the movement you should know. And they were looking for, they offered me something that they thought was going to be more up my alley, and I wasn't really interested in it. And he said, "Well, what are you interested in?" I said, "Well, I love I'm doing this Detroit soul music thing." And they said, "Well, you already got a guy who's doing Motown." I'm like, "Well, it's not Motown, it's
No, it's
post
completely
Motown."
different. It's completely different.
And he says,
Yes.
"But I like psychedelic music." He said, "Oh, we haven't been able to find anybody to do psychedelic music." So I did
Slam dunk.
psychedelic music.
Right.
Yeah. And I've gotten some criticism from people on it because I don't focus on the real there are obvious choices in there, but I focus on a lot of the music. I view psychedelia as this sort of gear from which it took in, it came out of R&B and rock and roll, and out of it comes every conceivable musical form of the 1970s. Prog comes out of it, prog rock, soul funk, hard rock even takes, the idea of these long extended jams.
Right. Right.
It becomes the source for all this music. I mean, where was, King Crimson, early Genesis,
For
early
sure.
Yes?
Fripp.
This
Fripp.
all comes out of
Absolutely.
it.
Okay. So
And it,
go. Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I list artists knowing that it's this gear through which all these other forms happen. I said there's a period of, 1 year, less than 1 year, where you have the release of Pet Sounds, Revolver, and Blonde on Blonde. And by 3 artists who were already established in their fields. All 3 records totally broke the style that they were doing just 6 months earlier.
Completely.
And after that, nothing's quite the same.
True.
And so I said, you've got to listen to Pet Sounds. You've got to listen to Revolver. You've got to listen to Blonde on Blonde. And I've had some Dylan purists say, Dylan doesn't do psychedelia. Why would you list Blonde on Blonde? And I'm like, that's 4 sides of pure stream of consciousness. And if that didn't help somehow influence lyrical style of psychedelia, then I don't know what in hell did. So, I put in records that aren't considered psychedelic, but I said I look at it as a mixer through which many things came. Well, to get there, you have to know what went into it.
Definitely. So where did you start it as, or where did you pick it up? Some of the band. Tell me. Just name some of the
Sure.
some of the bands, so
Yeah.
I can at least also get in my mind where you
Yeah.
were.
Well, as I said, I started with this idea that, Pet Sounds, Revolver, and Blonde on Blonde.
Right.
But I say, that there's this, if we go back a little further, we have the Beau Brummels, we have the Byrds, we have this other sound that's not rock and roll, it's not folk music. You've got Sly Stone producing the Beau Brummels. And then you get these bands like Blue Cheer who are playing a form of rock that Black Sabbath would later make its mark on, but they're doing it 4 years earlier.
Yeah.
They're doing
yeah,
Summertime Blues.
Yeah.
And so I start off with, I said Mickey Mouse produced Donovan's Sunshine Superman album.
Okay.
And then you have Blue Cheer. And then you have everything starts rolling away into it. It's like a going out of control. Everything just sort of happens one upon another. And, the early Pink Floyd with Syd Barrett figures in there. Well, you also have to mention Soft Machine and Robert Wyatt, who are more like King Crimson would become. All these bands, there's this overlap, and it's music went from being an R&B based pop sound to something entirely different.
Right. How did the industry embrace that?
The way they embrace anything that'll make money, they find it,
they exploit it.
They exploit it, and I like the song Incense and Peppermint, but I say, look at the Strawberry Alarm Clock. That's basically a constructed boy band for psychedelia.
I know.
I mean, you can put, and Nick Mason, the drummer of Pink Floyd, talked about it in his book on Floyd history, and he said, suddenly there was this explosion of psychedelic groups, and he said, 6 months earlier they were in their Cecil G suits playing R&B standards, and now 6 months later they're wearing beads and loon pants, to look like hippies, still playing R&B riffs.
Right.
So, he said it was, people caught onto it and saw that they could, make a sound. I also talk about a genre of music that gets overlooked out of England called freakbeat, and it's the sound that came between the sort of mod and pop sound of 64, 65, and then the true blown psychedelia of 67. So you have people like John's Children, of which Mark Bolan was a member.
T-Rex, John, okay. Right.
Yeah, and you had a group like Tomorrow, in which Steve Howe was a member. So you have all these guys who later on, The Move, which had Jeff Lynne and Bev Bevan.
That's correct.
So all these guys who become post-psychedelic stars are starting off in this sort of freak beat sound.
Interesting.
And that genre of music in England becomes a huge, sort of like a big accelerator toward psychedelia.
Right. Yeah. My friend of mine wrote, I told you, I think when we originally talked, and we did a little bit of, I did a voiceover for a story he wrote. He toured with the Pretty Things in 99. No, it was after the fact. But what I had to do was I had to do all this research, and they were in the thick of it in 65. They 65, 66, 67, they went through the whole thing.
Yeah.
SF Sorrow, the whole thing with the rock operas, and I mean, it was a big deal in England, that whole thing.
But so freakbeat is overlooked as a
very much so.
The American rock got more complex. What Wilson was doing, what Dylan was doing, it's much more complex, much more cerebral. What's happening in England is they're taking it up a notch with really electrified sound, very tight arrangements, but definitely about to spin off and explode into something else, and it did.
That's true. You mentioned Sly. I think another giant
guy who
has
not received. He and both Sly Stone and Arthur Lee of Love are two African-American musicians who have not gotten their due. We focus on Hendrix because he's definitely due that. We focus on Prince. We focus on Stevie Wonder. These guys are giants. But Sly Stone and Arthur Lee broke a lot of that mold that made the later artists come along.
Why do you think they didn't? Why do you think, like, for instance, Arthur Lee is one thing, but Sly was a bona fide entertainer, showbiz character?
Yeah, I don't know. Probably, again, if something's a hit, you commodify it and you drain the hell out of it until the artist has nothing left.
I guess.
And Sly is a person who he worked best when he was producing other artists because he was totally in control. When he had total control, it worked.
Yeah, that was the only way he could really work, I think.
It's like George Clinton. If you try to if you try to compartmentalize George Clinton, it ain't going to work.
Right.
The guy's got to be completely self-sufficient.
That's true. I mean, that early 70s and mid 70s stuff was just, the R&B stuff was amazing. I mean, I was a big Brothers Johnson fan. These guys were just so talented. And obviously the times played a point, but if they could make money, they would, if they had hits, they were able to really get somewhere. But Sly, just he's off the charts.
And I should have given him more room in the book, but I realized that I was doing research on him and I'm like, this guy, you can't kind of summarize this guy because this book's all about entries, artists and albums.
Right.
And it's an entry based. Sly should not be written about as an entry-based artist. He is an artist.
He's
like a Brian.
He's
on his own. He is on his own, and you have to look at him as not just as leader of Sly and the Family Stone, but a producer, arranger, author, and socially forward musician.
Exactly. Agreed. He's a character.
Yeah, I left him underrepresented only because I felt I couldn't do justice to him without giving him about 200 pages.
Yeah, but I don't think I don't think it called for it. Really, thinking about it, you touched on it, but again, you could have gone into such serious depth with him.
Well, and the book is supposed to be an introduction, so the idea is that you mention all these things and you get people interested to say, "Oh, what's this?"
Right. Let me check it out.
Yeah, sort of like for me, it was, "What's a Deep Purple?"
So what's coming up for you? Anything new that we might want to,
Well, I've been delayed. You mean of my own work, or?
Yeah, your own work. Just in general. I mean, obviously the books are, are out there, and we're gonna again, put them down in the description so people could check them out. But what are you working on? Anything new that's
Well,
coming
yeah,
soon?
I'm finally circling back around to the post Motown Detroit soul music,
Oh, great.
and I've crawled to a slow, moved, reduced to a slow crawl because of my job, but I'm still focused on making that because living 40 miles from Detroit, coming from Los Angeles, people go to Los Angeles, and I'm sure you feel the same about New York. People come there, they visit for a week or a month or a year, and then they go back to wherever they're from, and then they have all these opinions about the city. Oh, it's too crowded, it's always traffic, there's too much smog,
Right.
it's all superficial. And it's like, screw you, that's my hometown. I'm sure in New York you feel the same way. People
Oh,
come
yeah.
in,
Yeah.
oh, I've been to New York. You live there for a year, and your
Right.
parents funded you in a Lower East Side apartment, and you don't get a right to talk about it.
Good one. I like that. Good hit there.
But do you feel that? You get tired of people who aren't from New York telling you what New York is like.
Yeah, for sure.
And
for sure.
Detroit's the same thing. Detroit is, for years, was looked down upon. Oh, this poor city. People would go in and get the hell out because they were afraid of it, and it gets a bad rap. And the scene,
absolutely.
and Motown left in '68, but the city still holds on to Motown as being Detroit. Like, that label closed shop. They from '68 to '71.
LA,
they slowly,
yeah, they were West Coast, right?
Yeah, but they moved out over 3 years, and after 1971, they closed the door, and that was it.
Interesting.
And it's not been part of the city since then. The museum's there, and the museum's there because Gordy's sister, Esther, wanted to preserve it.
Got you.
And there wouldn't be, if it wasn't for the museum, there wouldn't be a sense of Motown being part of Detroit. So the thing is, there was a lot of great music made in the city before Motown. There was a lot of great music made after Motown. And what Holland Dozier and Holland did is they had a couple of labels. They released a ton of records after Motown left, and then they disappeared. Those records disappeared, and that music disappeared. And for me, I found it perplexing that 3 of the great American songwriters, if you go back and take Gershwin, you take Irving Berlin, you take Lieber Stoller, you take Holland Dozier Holland are right in there. Smokey Robinson's in there. Stevie Wonder's in there. But Holland Dozier Holland, these guys left their company, created a label, recorded hundreds of sides, and you can't find them anymore. And no one's written about them.
Yeah.
Why is that? And once I heard this music again, I hadn't heard it since I was a kid, and I remember it played on AM and FM stations as a kid. That this was the sound of early '70s soul music.
Correct.
And for me, I'm writing about that music because it hasn't been written about. 2, Holland Dozier Holland have continued to be creative long after Motown, and that this label was only 5 years of their life or 6 years of their life, but it was an important time when the city goes from being this thriving, leading, nation leading city to being a city that slowly is coming unglued.
Yeah.
And Holland Dozier Holland, the label eventually folds. They go back to working for Gordy in Los Angeles, and the city kind of fades away until you have the rise of, techno music with the Belleville 3.
Okay.
And that becomes the next sort of rebirth of the city.
Right.
Is techno music gets this rebirth out of nothing because the city had kind of collapsed in on itself artistically. And there was, these guys were making music that nobody else could make. And, there was a sense of it being very illegal because they would take over abandoned buildings and hold parties, and they would make techno. And that's
right, the house parties. Right.
So, I was interested in this period between Motown leaving and the arrival of techno. What happened? And there was a lot that happened, but it's been erased from the memory.
That's interesting. That sounds great. That sounds great. So I think looking forward to that one.
I'm looking forward to writing it. It was what I was originally going to start with, but then you get an offer to write on Brian Wilson. Well, I'm not going to turn it down.
Right,
you get an offer to write about psychedelia. I didn't want to turn it down.
Yeah, no. So you got this coming, which is great. Well, that's amazing. A wealth of information, and I think we could. like I said, we could probably go Holland Dozer Holland for another 3 hours.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that when that does happen, we can go
Yeah.
a little bit, because I still, big Motown fan. I mean, their songwriting is just mind boggling. Even just, it's funny from a musical point of view, I have charts from them. I have songbooks of them, of
Yeah.
stuff written. And that music also in its own right is so simple.
Yeah.
It is scary simple.
Yeah.
You
It's
know,
all in the arrangement.
it is. It's all in the arrangement. Not to mention also who the singers and the players
Yeah.
that they had that were able to execute was just really incredible. So I want to say thanks so much. It was an absolute pleasure. I'm glad that you agreed to come on. I mean, I learned a ton. We were all kind of a little bit all over the map, but that's a good thing. That's a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I had fun, and I hope you did too. I wish you only the best.
Thank you.
Once again, the name of the book for the Brian Wilson, I'm going to let you say. Tell us that you have a
Yeah.
copy of that. Show us what's going on.
It's The Words and Music of Brian Wilson, and it's part of the Prager Singer-Songwriter Collection. So it's part of a collection of books on singer-songwriters. And then the other book is Listen to Psychedelic Rock, Exploring a Musical Genre. And that too is part of a series called Exploring Music, and can find them on Amazon, at Barnes and Noble. You can order them from your store, because it's mostly, they work mostly in academic publishing. It's not the sort of thing you naturally find on the shelf, but any bookstore can order it.
Fantastic. Great. I want to say thanks so much to Christian Matias-MECCA.
And thank you, Louis.
And it really was a pleasure. I wish you only the best. Stay well. Good to talk to you. And I'm hoping you and I will absolutely stay in touch.
We definitely will.
Closing doors, please.